Hello, welcome to our virtual talk of virtual remains. I don't think I've said that yet. So it's nice to see you all, those of you that are here, see your names or your pictures. I'm Veronica Kesnick, I'm the executive director, and it's my privilege to be here today with everyone, and with Shane and Darren and TK for this lovely screening and robust conversation. Before we get started, of course, for those of you who have not yet seen the exhibition in person, it is up through August 1st. I don't know if you're as shocked or surprised or grateful as I that June is right around the corner. So there's only just a few more months before the shows close, and we will be giving updates about what's coming down the pike for the FY 2022 season. So stay tuned, announcements forthcoming. And of course, Atlanta Contemporary remains free and open and accessible to all. But if you're not a member, you'd like to be a donor and supporter, our Join in June campaign launches June 1st. So beware of shameless solicitations for donations and fundraising to be coming your way in the next couple of weeks. Before I introduce TK, I know that we are all going to recognize the land that we are on. So I will start with TK and then Shane and then Darren, and then I will introduce TK. So TK.
Howdy, y'all. I am TK Smith, and I am zooming into you from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I am on Lenape land.
Hey, everybody. I'm Shane Deadman, and I'm currently based in Atlanta, Georgia, on Muskogee Creek land.
Hi, y'all. My name is Darren Fowler, pronouns they, them. And I'm also in Atlanta, and I'm on Muskogee Creek tribe land as well.
Welcome. Thank you for acknowledging the land that you are on. So we will get started. So I have TK's official bio, of course, as well. But I also just want to say that I'm just so grateful to not only be able to read TK's bio, but also count TK as a friend and a colleague. And I'm so excited and grateful to his work with this exhibition and the work that I am confident he's going to do for decades to come in the field. So TK Smith is a Philadelphia-based curator, writer, and cultural historian. He is the curator of Virtual Remains, the exhibition within the project spaces of the 2021 Atlanta Biennial. The exhibition features multimedia installations by Adam Forrester, Artemis Jenkins, Danielle Deadweiler, and Shane Deadman. So TK, take it away.
Thank you so much, Veronica, and thank you to the Contemporary and everyone who made this exhibition possible. The first thing I'll go ahead and say is I'll briefly describe myself for accessibility reasons. So I'm TK Smith. I am a Black man with braided hair sitting in a living room in Philadelphia. I'm wearing a tan shirt and dark tortoiseshell glasses in front of a triptych of images of St. Louis. All right. And I have the pleasure of introducing Shane Deadman. Shane Deadman, not to steal Veronica's shine, but Shane Deadman is a good friend of mine, as well as an artist that I admire and I have had the greatest pleasure of working with. Shane has produced and is premiering this beautiful trilogy of film in the 2021 Atlanta Biennial in Virtual Remains. And it has just been an amazing experience to watch, one, the films develop, Shane develop as an artist, and to see folks interact with the work. So if you haven't seen the work yet, it's in Shoot Space at the Contemporary. It's free and it's open all the time. So please, if you enjoy it here, please go see it in the space, because it is an installation and it does have a particular vibe and it does have a particular mood in that space. But we're glad you can join us here virtually. So Shane Deadman is a trans-masculine, non-binary, lens-based artist, educator, and writer. Shane identifies as a public amateur, archivist, and alchemist of visual and material production. While inhabiting trans-dimensional somatics, their work validates divergent selfdom through the performance of absurd disidentification, subversive comedy, glitch, and camp. As an artist, their primary concern is that of sustaining a liberated queer existence. He contemplates the rhizomes of trans poetics, aesthetics, survivalist art making, and inclusivity while being in process with fringe media, accessibility, incarnated trauma, and transnational momentum. They utilize methodologies of filmmaking, self-portraiture, GIFs, and poet's memoir that exist in immersive installations, screenings, publications, and black box cyberspace, like this one, like at the Atlanta Contemporary. Deadman's videos have shown at Landmark's Midtown Art Cinema for Out on Film 2019, the Plaza Theater, iDrum, virtually on Facebook Live, and the 2020 No Flash Film Festival. He's written about in Wussy Mag, and we'd love to thank Nicholas Goodley for that beautiful and thoughtful write-up that Wussy Mag had that will be dropped in the chat, and that they published in March on this trilogy of film, and it has the same title as this event. Also, Shane has appeared in Analog Cookbook, Burnaway. He's held artist residencies at TAR, Welcome Hill Studios, the Ionian Center for the Arts and Culture, Joshua Tree Highlands. In addition to art making, Shane has worked as an arts educator in a juvenile detention center, assistant to queer elder archivist, art handled in studios, galleries, museums, and private collections across the southeastern United States. He's received his BFA in photography from Georgia State University and is currently located in Atlanta with his cats, Lester and Boulder. So thank you, Shane, for joining us. If you could offer the folks at home a brief description of your physical self.
Yes, so I am a white, transmasculine, non-binary person with blondish pink hair, and I have a white shirt on that says trans people are hot in red text, and I am in front of a log cabin quilt that was made by my great-grandmother while I was still in the womb.
I love quilts. We might come back to that. We are also joined today by Darren Fowler, who has been so kind to join us on this panel and bring their expertise. Darren Fowler is a visiting professor of film and media studies at Colorado College and a doctoral candidate in the School of Film, Media, and Theater at Georgia State University. Their research examines the aesthetics, politics of queer media, art, and activism, with a particular focus on the material practices and desires of AIDS activists, both historical and today. Their work has appeared in the Routledge Companion to Media and Risk, Liquid Blackness Journal, and in the Media Res. Darren, thank you for joining us. If you could offer the folks a physical description of yourself.
Absolutely. Thanks first for having me. Very excited. So I'm a white non-binary person with short cropped hair, with purple tortoise glasses. I'm in my apartment in Atlanta with a somewhat large male nude in the background. And I'm wearing gold with like colorful gem heart earrings with a black polka top over a white blouse.
Thank you so much. So the way that this is going to go today is we are going to start with showing the first two films. They're a little shorter. Then we're going to open up for a short panel discussion between our panelists. And then we're going to screen the larger film, another short panelist discussion, and then open it up to Q&A. And we ask that if you have any questions at any time, that you remain muted, but you share them in the comments, send us a message, and we will make sure to share them at the appropriate time with the panelists. And so what can I say about this trilogy of film? I can say a lot about this trilogy of film, but we have the privilege of being able to actually see them today. So Physical Body of Work is a trilogy of experimental films that contemplate the loss of one's personal archive as a rite of passage or as a tragedy. The first film, Part 1, Amnesia, chronicles the confrontation between water and words, between nature and hubris, revealing the archive in its vulnerable and damaged state. The film lays bare the countless pages of illegible text and festering Black mold. Then we'll move on to Part 2, which is Aporia, which ritualizes the destruction of the archive in flames. Allowing the pages to succumb to nature, Deadman allows the past traumas and abuses to be shed like old skin. The flames are threateningly triumphant. As they feed on the evidence of who Deadman was, they illuminate the endless potentials of multiplicity. And so please enjoy the first two films.
lives are gone. The whispers of a child's self were lost in a flood as I waited in doubt on a foreign experience of planning a new life. The whispers of a child's self. It asked me for I am the embodiment of philosophy's demise. Looked upon as surface, and now allow nature to deny depth. I will no longer be his victim. I have become the hearth I own, and will be the only one to understand. I was submerged in pain. I destroyed it all. The ramblings of a broken soul. The dream of the victim to be right. It's all gone over the range. Earn the veil in its capture on confession. It is but a primordial layer upon the lyrical chrysalis of the young writer's claim to claim of the enemy. A distant lullaby of truth and lies, denial and...
Thank you so much, Shane.
Yeah, totally.
If you could, before we get started with our panelist questions, could you give the folks at home a little background on the archive itself and the story behind these two films?
Yeah, so I've lived in Atlanta for it's been about eight and a half years now. I originally came here for Georgia State and stayed after I graduated. I had a collection of writings from the first time that I wrote a poem from my childhood. And it was shortly after I read The House on Mango Street. I started writing poems. I was also inspired by the kind of Gothic style of Edgar Allan Poe as well. So I had a lot of random things, and I was developing my writing style and practice. There were also specific journals that I had for my travels. So I would buy a notebook when I would go somewhere so that I could dedicate it to that place. And I had some watercolors from a book that I drew in while I was in Joshua Tree. I had my first watercolors that I felt proud of. And there was a lot of processing, a lot of like journal writing based processing of things that had happened to me in my life. And I stored all of this in a friend's parents' basement while I was trying to make a life in Berlin. I knew I needed to store my art archive I just didn't have the money for climate control, storage space that would be very secure. So I'm an art handler, so all of my art was secured. It was sealed. None of it was destroyed. But these writings were kept in this wooden chest that I had put a lock on, not knowing that there were holes in the bottom of the chest. And so when my friend gave me the news after I had come back from Berlin, I wasn't able to get a visa because there are a lot of gatekeeping, bureaucratic procedures, specifically in Germany, so I went and I picked it up. I checked all of my art, made sure it was good. I'd been told that it had been in a flood, as Atlanta gets flooded. And I opened up the chest, the wooden chest, with a dear friend of mine, Madeline Conklin, because I didn't have the key anymore. I had lost the key. And we opened it up, pried it open, and everything was covered in mold. And it smelled really bad. I was afraid for my health. And I did some research to try and understand if there were any procedures that I could do to be able to salvage anything. I also had a signed copy of Inferno by Eileen Miles. All of my signed copies of books were in there as well. So I had like a signed copy of one of Anis Majgani's poetry books, who also was he's a huge influence of mine poetically. But yes, that kind of sums it up a bit. There's nothing really that you can do with black mold once you have it on a porous surface. And kind of the reason why I took it into my own hands to do something about this hazardous material was because I felt very uncomfortable handing it over to somebody who would have basically done the same thing that I did.
Thank you. Darren, if I could invite you to ask the first question.
Absolutely. No, this is great. And so, yeah, these first two films are just such rich texts. And so there's a lot of directions I kind of really want to go. But I want to start with kind of just like thinking about the archive and the way in which you're talking about the archive as like kind of like practice and as like kind of like act and like discipline. And so you have this line in Amnesia that an archive exists not as truth, but as proof. And it reminded me of lesbian theorist and historian Anne Chekovich and her writing on queer and trans archives and how they're made up, not necessarily by choice, of ephemera and oral histories. The reality of like our erasure as like queer and trans people and the violations of us have shifted our remembrances towards stories we pass down through our chosen families and posters, flyers, magazines, and other objects that mark the fact of us, but not the specificity of us. And so I wonder if you could speak more to this distinction between truth and proof and how that kind of informs your understanding kind of like the archival and archival practice, or just like the idea of the archive.
Yeah, totally. There's this really amazing text that I came across during my processing of this kind of material grief. And it is called Delete Your Archive, Trans Archival Practices. And I can also link that in a minute. But basically talking about how the writer Cassius was like, the trans archive has to have agency. Whoever is creating a trans archive needs to have full agency over what is included, and they also need to have the right to delete accounts or associations with their name or changing their name. And all of these things feed into the archive. I mean, digitally, that's a whole nother, conversation where in the US, we're not really allowed, there's not really a process to fully erase a dead name from the internet. This is something that is pretty standard in the European Union. There are procedures that you can go through. There are forms that you can submit. We kind of just don't have a precedent here to do that. And I think that a lot of people would abuse it, honestly. And non-trans people for like other forms of erasing identity. The archive for me as like proof is this proof of existence that is really important to me as a person, believing in myself and believing in my voice and the narrative of my life. But also because it's an obsession of mine. Derrida talks about archive fever as this thing that infects us, and it makes us want to put a mark on the world. The artist's hand, the individual's hand and history of that hand. This was also inspired by reading an article in a magazine. The article is titled "A Museum for James Baldwin." And something that just really made me so livid was the fact that when the person who wrote the article was going into his archive with his family members and then taking it to professional archivists or professional registrars, they were told that his personal library was not of value, did not have his hand enough in it in order for it to be saved. And Walt Whitman's fucking glasses are on display in a museum somewhere. They were kept. And that it makes me so enraged, even thinking about how Claude Cahun, who is a non-binary artist from the past, from the 20s, who escaped Nazi Germany and was living alone with their partner, who's also non-binary, creating portraits. And they are, from every academic text that I've seen, misgendered. And they have a complete essay titled "The Third Gender." And people will acknowledge that, but they will acknowledge the writing, but they will not acknowledge how that writing is applicable to the flesh. And it's really important for me to know that in the future there are going to be trans academics and archivists, and trans people will be in positions of power, because I think the crux of our culture is the white supremacist binary thought that has no nuance.
If I could jump,
yeah.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. Did I answer everything?
Oh yeah, no, it's this really amazing kind of like tension between the like, I love this idea of the proof of existence versus this like surveilling from like Ader, right? Like Cassius is like this surveilling gaze of this kind of normative consuming spectatorship. But that's not the kind of like negation of the value of an archive, but a kind of shifting of how the archive is formed and what it's able to do. And like, as you said, like keeping it in this like material and adaptive relationship with who and what is being archived, right? As opposed to just this like stale box of containment. That is how we normally think about the archive.
Yeah, and also it's a physical material thing. I mean, unless you have a digital archive, even in that sense, it is a physical thing. It is a hard drive, or it is a cloud that is stored on a modem somewhere. You know, the data is there. You know, it exists physically as well. But there will always be a question of how will this archive be held? How will it be stored? Who has the means of storage space that is climate controlled and the people to maintain it and the materials in order to pack it so that it's resistant to destruction? It's very much like the relics of the bodies of saints, honestly.
That's kind of where I want to jump in, because I feel like where I was most intrigued was how body-like you allowed this inanimate physical object to be. You've already used the term flesh, and I'm thinking of the innate desire that it takes to begin to collect. Who gives the archive meaning, who gives the archive purpose is usually the collector, the person behind the mirror or the person behind the curtain. Talking about the archive as this collection of ideas, collection of memory, collection of all of these things, like a body, and also it being tangible and you know, it can be destroyed, it can be damaged, it can grow, it can shrink, it can all these things like an organic being. Also really highlights the limitations of both the physical body when thinking of the intangible parts of being, gender, sexuality, different modes of existing in the world, that people rely on flesh to demarcate, right? People rely on flesh to say what your gender is, and they rely on flesh to say who you should be sexually attracted to. The limitations of the body to do that, and the limitations of the archive to tell the truth. It doesn't tell the truth. Just like a body doesn't always demarcate these particular things, the archive can be clever and subversive and flawed and damaged and traumatized and hurt. It can be all of these things. And so in thinking of these films like a portrait of a body of the archive, can you say why you decided to leave your body out of these two films? There's no human body. It's just the archive as it takes on these trans states of being.
Yeah. So the first one, I have this thing where I kind of believe that any given moment could be a precious moment. I often, when I'm experiencing something, I'm almost like bookmarking it as like, I will remember this moment in the future, this sensation in the future, in a different context. And there's kind of this idea that healing isn't linear. You're always consistently going back and forward and time traveling through trauma, dissociation. And I needed to air out that mold, honestly. So I decided to take it outside, which was followed by let me lay it in the sun and at least just like unpack it. And then just the obsessive nature of my personal documentation, I grabbed my camera and went outside. And a lot of like the material aspect of it was this like beautiful compiling, and almost, I've made paper before, so it was kind of this beautiful pulp at the same time as it was hazardous. Will you remind me of the latter bit of your question, please?
I think that's
body. Oh, yes. Okay, that's where I was going. Okay, cool. So the second film, so Aporia actually does feature my body, but just in glimpses. So there's, in the title sequence, I light multiple matches, and there's kind of this outline of my body going back and forth to the camera as well, going into the actual fire. I think that doing that, kind of like giving this like sense of shadow, the sense of like almost like symbolically like shadow self, leads very clearly like for me like into like a full representation of my body within part 3. And the labor is still there. I had to build a fire. I had to maintain a fire. I had to make sure that everything burned. I stayed out there for like 7 hours or something like that. I borrowed a friend's fire pit specifically for it, because I didn't have one at the time in my backyard. So there's also the kind of like post-production labor there. And what I really wanted to do with these two films was use the concept of visual contradiction with auditorial contradiction, because in the first film, you may not realize it, but Amnesia, the backing sounds are bugs at night. So it is a visual representation of the notebooks in the sun with audio from night. And the second one is a visual representation of a fire with rain in the background. I thought that was really important to kind of like give that what like aporia actually means, which is this state of contemplation, state of non-binary thinking, this state of confusion, but also interest. Yeah.
No, that was great. Darren, do you want to take the last one before we screen the third film?
Yeah, no. And that kind of like, I guess it's kind of an extension of some of the things that you were just talking about. But I've like, one of the things I'm really struck by is the use, like the choice of fire in this. And it reminds me of Ava Hayward and her writing as a kind of theorist of trans embodiment. And she talks about, like, she writes about starfish. And the way she talks about starfish is like, the way starfish survive and change and grow is that like one of their arms gets stuck on a rock or something and they just like rip it off. And it creates this cut, this wound that like is not a kind of mark of the body being damaged, but instead this opening for the body to change and grow and not to replicate itself and like just repeat the arm, but instead grow new arms that are going different directions and forming in different ways. And she wants to think about this in terms of trans embodiment, of thinking about the cut and the body as this like space of opening and the space of change and like radicalization and liberation, as opposed to a space of like damage and annihilation, the way that trans like surgicological and medicalizing happens, right, in the kind of popular discourse. And so I wanted to think about like, when I saw these films for the first time, I was like, that burning felt very similar to me. And I'm wondering if you could speak to like what that active, I mean, you've talked about it a little bit, but like that active burning, like itself and like the kind of work that it's trying to do and like what that like why like the active burning as a kind of like methodology here.
Yeah. I have a really good friend who is a poet, Juan Camilo Garcia, and he recently like moved to Texas, and within the last like couple of years, we had this conversation before he left. It was like the last conversation where I kind of told him where I was in my process, and he told me the story about how he had a suitcase of his poems and he just lost them. And I had all of these people kind of like witnessing to me what felt like, oh, this might be like an artist's rite of passage to kind of lose, and in order to kill your darlings, you know, to be able to push forward and to continue making. It's like what they tell you in art college is if you're making 3 years after you graduate, you'll be making the rest of your life. And for me, the fire represents this constant state of rage that fuels my life force that's based in a complete cut of a lot of the family that I was born with. And really not knowing who's going to bury me. Like there's this line in Amnesia, it's like I flow freely to an unmarked grave. And my dad is in his 70s. I don't have contact with my mother. I don't have contact with my blood brother. I don't have contact with any of my extended family. And being able to release these kind of naive ponderings or processing about the trauma that they subjected me to allowed me to come to full realization about what my boundaries with them are. And I mean, the rage is fueled by so many things, like every day, you know, everyday things, whether it's expressed verbally or not. It's there. The microaggressions are there. They're fully present, especially in the South. I think about walking on the street with like this shirt on, and I'm afraid that someone's going to harm me. If you're not angry about how this world is functioning, then like you're not listening.
Thank you for that. I think part of the reason why this film resonated so deeply with me and so deeply with this exhibition is that it is close and far away at the same time. You know, we are currently living in a state of extreme loss, mourning, and melancholy. We're also living in a time where people are the most documented they've ever been, and in a time where people are documenting themselves, which means in terms of history, in terms of culture, we're including way more voices, way more diversity, if you want to call it that, than has ever been brought to the table before when we're talking about an archive. We're also, I mean, any way you want to slice it, culturally, politically, artistically, there is an archive that existed, a limb, if you want to think of it that way, that has existed, that exists as it had. And in our ideologies of who we are, we hold on to that archive because it is how we have come to define ourselves. And then there are those thousands upon innumerable new limbs that are trying to grow with the privileges of the technology that we have now, the privileges of more voices at the table, more seats at the table, those limbs that are trying to push out and become whatever they will be, whatever direction they will grow, that are stunted by the need to hold on to that archive, that limb. And so this film is this beautiful articulation of what it means to lose that limb, not even by choice. Sometimes you don't have choice. Especially if you think about this in a global scale, people are losing their culture from war, from conflict, from economic or ecological disaster. Like things are happening that are destroying the archive as we knew it. And people have to adjust, and they have to survive. They have to adapt. And what comes from that adaptation when you are no longer who you thought you were, or you no longer have that physical evidence to say, I was this is who we are. What kind of imaginative, speculative, open space does that open up to become something for the present moment, if not for the future? So thank you. That was so thoughtful, and I wish we could keep talking, but we gotta screen this third film. The third film is called Folly, and it presents a departure into the psyche where the artist confronts memory as the final site of the loss of archive. Through the gesture figure, Deadman offers a scripted internal narrative where various aspects of the self meet and play. Known for both the jovial and the sinister, for their foolery and wisdom, the gesture figures are tools used to reveal the most complex, contradictory, and controversial aspects of the self. Referencing the histories and methodologies of experimental 20th century film, Folly is a tantalizing, fantastical journey away from the singular conceptions of the self toward the infinite. Shane, if you would. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Shane. So just to give you a kind of rundown of the last 20 minutes we have together, we're going to have a few more questions from the panelists, and then we're going to invite you all to contribute questions in the chat, and I'll filter those out to our panelists. So feel free at any moment to add a question you may have to the chat. And I'd also like to emphasize, this screener is an amazing opportunity, but there's nothing like seeing that film on the silver screen. Shane has provided an antique silver screen in shoot space, and the clarity, the beautiful luminescent clarity of that on that silver screen is just ridiculous. It's really something to see. So I hope, you all enjoy yourselves here, but you also, if you get the chance, go down to the Atlanta Contemporary and see it in person. So I'm going to again invite Darren to ask the first question.
Awesome. Yeah. I cannot wait to be able to go to the Contemporary now that I'm fully vaccinated, to be able to see it. Because I've been watching these for the last week or so, and watching them quite a few times. And it's just I can't wait to see the full texture and ornate beautifulment of them. And with that, that's kind of where I want my kind of question to go, is that we didn't really get to talk very much about the aesthetics of the films, and maybe we can return to that later, but I do want to talk about the aesthetics of this film and the significant shift in the style and tone and feel of this film, Polly, compared to Amnesia and Aporia, right, where the first two films have this very abstract kind of quality. They had a lot of texture on the surface of them, and they're kind of much I think whenever I imagine an experimental film, my brain goes to a lot of the aesthetics you're choosing in that film. Whereas here, you're moving into this ornate, glittering, kind of pretty image that is embracing the surface in a very different way. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about what that choice of that shift is for Folly, why that shift is so important for this film, and also how that works within this trilogy where we're marking this kind of arc, and how we arrive and we conclude, at least for this trilogy, in this kind of very ornate, glittering space.
Yeah. So I'll start by saying that I knew after Aporia I needed to do some narrative work. That's a large practice in the therapy that I have found most helpful, is returning to moments and being able to almost reprogram them as if your brain was a machine. So sinking back into them, doing kind of these I'm forgetting the word for it exactly. Hypnosis. There we go. These hypnosis kind of sessions, and the large practice of that is to be able to take yourself as you are now, in whatever moment you are currently, and to send yourself back into this memory so that you can provide what your child self needed in that moment, so that it's decharging that tension and releasing from the phenomenological body, because trauma is stored inside of the body. So I had a random idea back when I was at Welcome Hill Studios for resident. It was a month-long residency. It's in New Hampshire. It's built by a group of lesbians in the 70s who wanted a queer separatist space. And I did a lot. I was by myself for a month. It was the first time ever I was by myself for an extended period of time. I've always had roommates. I've always lived within my means, which aren't that much, to be honest. And there was this moment at the residency that I wrote down these 5 specific aspects of my personality that I had observed over that time of being by myself. And I kind of named them, I gendered them, I aged them, kind of like talked a little bit about like what aspect, it was like just a little write-up that lived in my archive, in my digital archive, for 3 years before I picked it back up. And I picked it back up because I was like, I need to do some narrative work. I remember those characters that I created, and I really need to do something with them. At the time that I created them, I wanted to take self-portraits. But then after the residency, this work developed. And I felt so much freer being able to work in a time-based medium. So I spent a lot of time in pre-production, developing and fleshing out how those characters could exist all in one space, and to create this space where they could exist together in this place called the Lucid Lounge, which is just a metaphor for my brain. So it was really important for me to kind of like actively work through those characters in performance, being witnessed, so that the charge of it allowed me to move past it and to use that intermediary time of grief to really kind of like lay the foundations of what I was looking for in my life after that, and what my process would look like. And this is the first time that I've worked with a crew, as far as like on my own pieces. I've worked on crews for other people's pieces. I've produced, I've assistant directed, I've production assistant, second camera assistant. I've done a lot of stuff. But just being able to feel held in my process and supported, which was also supported by, the first 2 films were supported by Tar Project in Atlanta. And they give a year-long residency that doesn't have spatial, access, but you receive therapy once a week. It was the first time I was receiving therapy from a non-binary person, which was groundbreaking. And we had monthly meetups with fellow cohorts to kind of talk through what things we were going through, roadblock wise with our work. So it really was that entire foundation, and also including TK. It's like we had so many screenings, so many check-ins, progress. Like I'm so grateful for that, because it's been like stuck in my head for years. And when I'm in everyday life, I don't really get the opportunity to talk this about my art. because of the lack of accessibility that people feel to creative work.
I mean, that something I really love about that kind of description is like this like description of a kind of like queer trans community being made. And when we think about community gets kind of like buzzword out into just like anything of like whatever, like any kind of proximity of relation becomes community. But like what you're talking about here is community as a labor, right? And it's an act of like being present for that. It's not just a shared identity, but it's a shared labor.
Yeah,
and I think that
one of my big foundational pieces theoretically is What is Art by Leo Tolstoy. And he talks about how the composer, the orchestra instructor, that's the right word for that, right? Yes? Okay. The orchestra constructor gets all the credit. And there's an entire orchestra, and then there's an entire construction crew that builds the space, and there's entire staff that maintains the space. And that one individual is not self-made, because nobody is self-made.
Yeah, again, like it's I don't know if I named Rosalind Galt a second ago when I named Pretty, but like she has this really amazing quote of like that, like I can't remember the exactness of it, but like that queer labor can change matter into what it needs to be in the moment. And like there's something about like that Tolstoy kind of like description of like the conductor and of the space, and what you're describing here of like the production of this aesthetic and of this form comes from this like taking what is available to you and the kind of the queer possibilities and trans possibilities in front of you because of community, and laboring through them in order to produce what is needed for you, but also maybe what you imagine is needed for kind of trans liberatory aesthetic.
Totally.
And seeing the kind of intimacies of those like community, labor, and aesthetics here.
One of the also major inspirations that was kind of circling in my brain during this time was the structuralist filmmakers, specifically Peter Kobolka, who talks about film as a recipe, as a meal, and how food is the ultimate form of art because it contains the most sensory experience. Film is two senses. And it's a combination of all of these elements that on their own are okay, they're fine, you know, but together with like preparation of each piece and then incorporation and then the time that it takes to cook that, to alchemize it into another form. All of that leads up to the consumption of it.
We're running short on time. So one of the really beautiful poetic things about this trilogy of film being in the 2021 Atlanta Biennial, being in Virtual Remains, is that the work returns to a basement. Shoot Space is a basement. And it has a beautiful kind of arc that it premieres here, but also there's an elemental arc in the film where the last figure returns to water. And we start the films with this beautiful flood siren warning us of giving us that anxiety, that anticipation. Can you talk about that arc of what that element means? You know, we kind of talked about fire. What does water become after you've processed with your internal selves?
Yeah, a lot there. So I'm kind of obsessed with kind of like our knowledge, human knowledge of the water world. Because I think that symbolically it's referential to specifically for me, sacred femininity, this abyss, this depth that philosophy can never describe, this complexity, this complete, blah, you know. I have an interview and writing that TK and I collaborated on, that's coming out in Analog Cookbook soon. And I wrote a little bit in my interview about it. Do you mind if I read that bit? Okay, cool. So the piano piece at the end is by Maurice Ravel. So Maurice Ravel is my favorite composer. And when I searched him in freesound.org, which was the open source platform I used for my a lot of the sound clips that I sampled, this gorgeous take by pianist Vladimir Oppenheim popped up. Ondine is the first movement of the suite titled Gaspard de la Nuit, or Treasurer of the Night, which was 3 poems by Aloysius Bertrand. This is a quote from Wikipedia. Quote, Ondine is a tale of the water nymph Undine singing to seduce the observer into visiting her kingdom deep at the bottom of a lake. Of the work, Ravel himself said, quote, Gaspard has been a devil in coming, but that is only logical since it was he who is the author of the poems. My ambition is to say with notes what a poet expresses with words. As a kid, I grew up in Florida and would go to the beach with my dad a lot. Therefore, I'm fascinated by the history of our knowledge of water worlds. I'm inspired by pirates, the mythic siren, the nymph, and the mermaid that lures observers into the abyss of sacred femininity. According to the article, quote, the incredible true history of gay pirates in their strangely modern world on Gay Star News, they, or pirates, never engaged in combat without embracing each other. I'm inspired by imagining the queer occupation of space and interested in entertaining thoughts of spatial queer separatism and escapism. When I read about Ondine, there was much talk about the solo piano's imitation of waterfalls. I knew it fit perfectly with the closing scene. So there's this returning to the water. I'm also alluding to Ophelia, you know, one of my favorite paintings. I'm going to recreate that painting the rest of my life. And this idea of madness that is so often enforced onto bodies that do not construct themselves or fit within the binary. So like going back to what Darren was saying about pretty and this glittery kind of surface, is knowing that philosophy has for so long been this surface level idea that never ventured into low-income neighborhoods to learn about people that weren't middle-class ignorant, you know? So this glitch, for me, that I've been noticing aesthetically in things like I Will Destroy You and things like Mr. Robot. So this glitch, this overt oversaturated, imperfect image can somehow represent the internal workings of the mind. And I was also inspired by Legacy Russell with her work, Glitch Feminism. And I'm going to read just a little quote from her real quick. Glitch is a gerund, an action ongoing. It is activism that unfolds with boundless extravagance. Nonetheless, undercurrent to this journey is an irrefutable tension. The glitched body is, according to UX designer, coder, and founder of collective at Afrofutures, UK Florence Okoye, quote, simultaneously observed, watched, tagged, and controlled, whilst also invisible to the ideative, creative, and productive structures of the techno-industrial complex.
Darren, did you want to have any last words?
I love that quote. I love this like language of like opacity, of like moving to transparency and opacity, and like the like ways in which, in particular, when we think about marginalized identities, there's this expectation of transparency, of like hyper visibility and accessibility to our identities, our bodies, our histories, our communities, and there's powerful about that, like that desire for opacity and not being readable, which goes back to like Cassius, like you referenced at the beginning, and also to this like desire to abstract, and the way in which abstraction is this tool of like becoming, like leaving one's body to do something, do other kind of work. That like Avram Finkelstein has described as the kind of the only safe space for queerness, or for the queer body, right? And so yeah, so like those are like hearing that glitch description like really like spoke to that like tension and that desire, and also like the ways in which your archive is also doing that really complicated work of trying to negotiate those different spaces.
Yeah.
Well, Shane, did you want to respond?
I guess I wanted to say, okay, I had a thought and then I lost it just because like you kept going and it was all brilliant. You were talking about, it wasn't surface, it was, will you back up just real quick and say a couple of words more about what you just said?
Oh, about the like tension between opacity and transparency.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the layering of the image, at least for me, has this kind of comfort. This comfort that I find in layering in general, layering clothes on my body, you know, like being able to either give access to this very ephemeral aspect of me that is constantly changing and fluid. And to trust that people will hold space for it, or at least have the kind of formulative backing to like be in conversation. I find that is really difficult. But also along with all of the color play, being able to color block and make all of these beautiful effects, that all came from an inherent love for analog photography, for being trained in analog photography and knowing that analog is more accessible as a startup than anything digital, because the market is way overpriced and the technology is completely shifting and changing at a rapid pace. So being able to digitally do what I like to do, like tactilely, and engaging in the digital, the virtual, which often for queer and trans people is the way that we find each other, the way that we, in isolation, being able to feel validated or appreciated or seen, sees also these digital skins, as Legacy Russell says.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Just to be thoughtful of folks' time, we're going to go ahead and close with a poem from Shane. Shane, if you're ready.
Yeah. So this is the kind of overarching poem for the work. There are poems within the work, but this is kind of like, more descriptive of the trilogy in itself. So it's called On Queer Rebirth. The archive is not truth. The archive is power over history. The archive is memory, is pulse, the knowledge one must access, to activate it, to bring it to light. What remains valuable within the desolate sepulture? What metaphysical curation will emit the pheromonal essence of truest self? There is no one true self, just as there is no one true history. Continue to unravel transtemporal time travel. Y'all are amazing. I love y'all so much.
Thank you. Thank you to Shane. Thank you for Darren. Thank you to the Atlanta Contemporary, Veronica. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope that you will take the time to come to the Atlanta Contemporary. It is free. It's open just about every day but Monday, to check out the 2021 Atlanta Biennial, to check out Virtual Remains, and of course, to check out Shane Deadman's trilogy of film. So thank you all so much. And
thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you. We hope that everyone has a wonderful day. Darren, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Thank you, TK and Shane and Darren, and stay safe, stay healthy, and keep doing the work. Art is essential.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Thanks, y'all.
Bye now.
Toodles.
Bye, y'all. This is great.